Welcome to the High Voltage AI Podcast. We're diving deep into some crucial topics for electric utility engineers this week, all part of our special series featured in the PXRD newsletter on Substack. Yesterday, we really broke down FERC Order 1920, that landmark federal regulation redefining how utilities plan and pay for regional transmission. We focused on the 7 benefit categories, changing project evaluation. Today, we're projecting those insights forward, specifically 20-year planning horizons. Engineering for 2045 today. It's really about how utilities are designing infrastructure for a future that's, well, inherently uncertain, a huge challenge.
That's absolutely right. And the core challenge isn't just, extending existing plans a bit longer. It's about fundamentally changing our whole approach to, long-term infrastructure design. I mean, just imagine trying to design for electricity demand way out in 2045 when, frankly, you can't even confidently predict load growth for, 2027?
Right.
So this deep dive will explore exactly how utilities are tackling that seemingly impossible task.
Okay, so let's start by looking back a bit. For decades, transmission planning relied on those traditional, say, 10 to 15-year forecasts.
Yeah.
How did we typically plan then? And why doesn't that work anymore for 20 years?
Well, traditionally, planning was mostly historical extrapolation. We use things like linear regression, correlating load growth to maybe GDP, gross domestic product, population trends, that kind of thing. And we relied really heavily on single-point forecasts. One number maybe with some basic sensitivity analysis around it. The core assumption was always gradual, sort of evolutionary change. Think like a steady 1.5% plus or minus maybe 0.5% annual load growth. It felt predictable.
Okay, predictable.
But here's where it gets really interesting for planners today. A 20-year horizon just completely breaks those old models. Why? Because of exponential uncertainty. Forecast accuracy just degrades significantly over time. You might be looking at, say, plus or minus 5 to 10% uncertainty at year 3. Then maybe plus or minus 15 to 25% by year 10. But get out to year 20, and you're often dealing with a common uncertainty range of plus or minus 50 to 100%.
Wow, 50 to 100%. That's a massive margin of error.
It is. It's like trying to hit a moving target, in the dark 20 years out.
So what kind of unprecedented changes, these multiple disruption potentials, are utilities trying to engineer around? What are those big unknowns over such a long timeline?
That's really the million-dollar question, isn't it? We're talking about disruptive forces that frankly barely existed or weren't a big factor 20 years ago. You've got the data center explosion that could consume anywhere from, say, 4 to maybe 15% of total grid consumption. Huge numbers.
Right.
Then transportation electrification. We could be looking at 20 to 40% vehicle electrification by 2045. And industrial electrification, too. Things like heat pumps, electric steel production, maybe even hydrogen production. Plus, the massive proliferation of distributed energy resources, rooftop solar, batteries everywhere.
And policy changes, too, I imagine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And significant climate policy shifts that could totally reshape the energy landscape. It's a lot of moving parts.
So, okay, if traditional forecasting is effectively dead for this purpose, what's replacing it? What's the new playbook?
Well, FERC Order 1920 actually mandates using multiple scenarios. Best practice now suggests developing maybe 4 to 6 robust scenarios. And these aren't just wild guesses. They're designed to cover diverse but still plausible outcomes for the future.
Plausible futures.
Yeah. So typically these include a reference case that's kind of like business as usual, continuing current trends. Then you often have a high electrification scenario envisioning really aggressive EV adoption and heating electrification. A high renewables one focusing on rapid clean energy deployment, lots of storage. A data center boom scenario projecting that accelerated hyperscale development. You also have to consider economic disruption, recessions, major supply chain problems.
Right, the downside risk.
Exactly. And finally, maybe a climate action scenario, which integrates comprehensive carbon pricing and policy changes.
That's quite a range. Can you give us a quick snapshot? What does each of those actually look like in terms of impact on the grid?
Sure. Let's break it down. So your reference case, that's typically moderate, maybe 2 to 3% annual load growth, slowing down later. You'd see maybe 30 to 40% renewable penetration by 2045 and fairly limited electrification compared to other scenarios.
Okay, the baseline.
Then high electrification. Imagine 60 to 80% of vehicle sales being electric by 2035, 50 to 70% of heating systems electrified. That could easily lead to a 15 to 25% increase in total electricity consumption. And winter peaks could start rivaling, maybe even exceeding summer peaks in some areas.
Wow, changing seasonal peaks.
Big shift. Now, high renewables. We're talking potentially adding 200 to 400 gigawatts of solar, 150 to 300 gigawatts of wind, 100 to 200 gigawatts of battery storage. That kind of scale demands a 50 to 100% increase in transmission capacity just to move all that energy.
A huge infrastructure build-out.
Absolutely. Then the data center boom. You could see 15 to 20% annual load growth just for data centers. They could reach maybe 20 to 25% of total grid consumption by 2045. And these facilities are huge, 200, 500 megawatts typical, maybe even over a gigawatt. That creates really concentrated regional bottlenecks.
Yeah, I can see that.
And lastly, economic disruption. That might mean a 10 to 20% decline in load, which leads to delayed investments, maybe a risk of stranded assets if you built too much too soon. This scenario really hammers home the need for flexible timing and maybe multiple technology pathways. Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Flexibility seems key.
It is. And what's really fascinating now is how engineers are designing infrastructure explicitly for that flexibility, not for just one outcome. This leads to really important design principles like modularity and expandability.
Okay, let's unpack that. Modularity and expandability. What does it actually look like on the ground? Say, for a new substation or maybe a transmission line.
Right. So instead of building a substation for its ultimate, 20-year capacity right on day one, which might be overkill initially, you might design and build it for maybe 10-year needs, but crucially with a very clear pre-designed expansion path. So for a new data center substation, maybe phase one gets you a 230 kilovolt to 69 kilovolt, 300 megavolt ampere transformer, 4 circuit positions, just what you need now.
Okay.
But the site layout, the foundations, the control house, they're all designed. So phases 2 and 3 can easily add more transformers, maybe upgrade the voltage to 500 kilovolt, get you to 1,000 megavolt ampere capacity as the demand actually materializes. No major teardown needed.
So build the bones for the future, but only flesh it out when needed.
Precisely. And for transmission lines, similar thinking. Maybe sizing the conductors for the ultimate long-term loading from the start because reconductoring is expensive, but perhaps doing phase stringing, adding more circuits later, or designing the towers robustly enough to handle advanced conductors like those high-temperature, low-sag ones down the road. And critically, securing enough right-of-way width now for a potential future double-circuit conversion. Getting right-of-way later is often the hardest part.
That makes a lot of sense. Secure the land now. And what about technology optionality? What future tech are we building pathways for?
Yeah, that's another big piece. It involves designing the system today so it can seamlessly accommodate what we call grid-enhancing technologies, or GETs, later on. We're talking about things like dynamic line ratings, knowing the real-time capacity of a line, not just a static rating. Power flow control using power electronics, which can push power where you need it more efficiently. Those advanced high-temperature, low-sag conductors I mentioned getting more capacity on existing structures, and even transmission-connected battery systems. Big batteries that can store and release power to help manage congestion or integrate renewables.
So you're building in the upgrade path.
Exactly. It's about ensuring that as these new valuable innovations emerge and mature, you don't have to do a massive rebuild. You can just integrate them, upgrade the system.
This raises a really interesting question then. How does the protection and control side evolve in this adaptive, future-proofed world? That must be a massive shift, too.
Oh, absolutely it is. It's moving away from static settings. We're seeing a definite move towards adaptive settings for protection systems. Systems that can automatically adjust their parameters based on real-time grid conditions, like topology changes or high renewable output.
Smarter relays.
Much smarter. And there's a huge emphasis now on robust fiber optic networks for the advanced communication needed for this. Enhanced cybersecurity is paramount, of course, with all this digitalization. And even the integration of artificial intelligence, AI, for things like ultra-fast fault detection, maybe predicting failures, optimizing responses. Control systems are becoming much more distributed too. Less central command, more local intelligence, and the ability to respond automatically to real-time market signals or grid needs. It's a much more dynamic, responsive system.
Okay, so we have these scenarios, this flexible design, but Beyond just creating these broad scenarios, how are planners using advanced analytical tools to really quantify this uncertainty, to make sense of all those possible futures?
This is where probabilistic planning really comes into its own. And it's a huge shift from the old deterministic ways. Instead of relying on that single forecast number, planners are now running literally thousands of simulations using techniques like Monte Carlo analysis.
Monte Carlo.
Yeah, it's essentially running countless what-if scenarios. You define your uncertain variables, load growth, fuel prices, technology costs, whatever, not as single points, but with statistical probability distributions. Then the software runs thousands, maybe tens of thousands of simulations, randomly sampling from those distributions each time. The output isn't one answer, but a probability distribution of outcomes like the likely range of project costs or the probability of needing a certain line upgrade by a certain year.
So you get a sense of the likelihood of different outcomes.
Exactly. Much richer information. And another key methodology gaining traction is real options analysis. Traditional net present value, NPV analysis, it just captures the expected benefits based on one forecast. It doesn't really value flexibility.
Right.
Real options, borrowing from finance, explicitly value the flexibility to adapt as conditions change. This includes things like timing options, the value of being able to delay or accelerate a project. Expansion options, the value of building modularly. Technology options, the value of being able to switch to a better tech later. And even abandonment options, the value of being able to walk away if a project turns sour. It puts a tangible dollar value on being agile.
Valuing flexibility itself. That's fascinating. Yeah. So connecting this to the bigger picture then, this isn't just about one utility making plans in a silo anymore, is it? It sounds like the scope is much broader.
You've hit on a critical point there. Absolutely not. FERC Order 1920 explicitly requires regional planning with benefits evaluated across multiple states. This means utilities have to work together through joint planning committees, using shared common scenarios, figuring out regional cost sharing, synchronizing their planning timelines.
That sounds complicated.
Oh, it's incredibly challenging. You have issues with data harmonization, getting everyone's models and assumptions aligned, and then coordinating regulatory approvals and cost recovery across different state commissions, each with its own priorities. It's a major undertaking.
I bet. And how does all this scenario work, this regional coordination, feed into actually choosing which projects get built? How do you pick the winners with so many variables in play?
Yeah, that's another fundamental shift. It's moving away from just evaluating individual projects in isolation one by one. We're now seeing utilities and regions use portfolio optimization across all those multiple scenarios. The goal isn't just to maximize the expected benefits, assuming one future happens. It's also about minimizing regret, reducing how bad things get in the worst case scenarios.
Right, protecting against the downside.
Exactly. And maximizing robustness, finding solutions or portfolios of solutions that perform reasonably well, maybe not perfectly, but adequately, across all the plausible scenarios you've identified. This often involves some pretty complex mathematical optimization frameworks to weigh the different probabilities and outcomes and identify those truly resilient, risk-adjusted investments.
That sounds like it requires some serious computing power and specialized tools. What kind of advanced software and data are really essential to pull off this level of planning?
It certainly does. You need the right tools. Advanced planning software is absolutely crucial. For the scenario management and the power flow analysis, the grid modeling, tools like Power World Simulator, Plexos, GridView, PSSC, those are industry standards.
Okay.
For the probabilistic analysis piece, the Monte Carlo stuff, you'd find specialized add-ins like At Risk or Crystal Ball, or planners might use general analytical platforms like MATLAB or the R statistical software. And then for the heavy-duty portfolio optimization, you need powerful solvers like CPLEX, Gurobi, or maybe FICO Express.
And the data behind it all.
Oh, the data requirements are huge. This all relies heavily on big data. We're talking 50-plus years of historical weather data for realistic renewable profiles, regional GDP and population trends, industrial development forecasts, technology cost curves, how fast will batteries get cheaper, policy data, market data, and data quality management becomes paramount over a 20-year horizon. Things like validating sources, quantifying the uncertainty in your input data, doing frequent updates, strict version control, getting the data right and keeping it right is a constant battle, but it's absolutely foundational.
It sounds like it. So theory and tools are one thing, but what does this actually look like in the real world? Can you walk us through a practical example? You mentioned ISO New England earlier. How does he tackle this?
Right. ISO New England is a really fantastic and quite public case study of putting these principles into practice. So, context. They manage the grid for 6 states. Current peak demand is around 28,000 megawatts. A lot of their transmission is pretty old, over 40 years old in many cases, and the region has very aggressive state-level net zero emissions goals, a real pressure cooker.
Okay, a challenging environment.
Definitely. So they developed a comprehensive 20-year plan reflecting 4 primary scenarios, similar to what we discussed: a baseline, a high electrification future, a high renewables future, and an economic uncertainty scenario. And their load projections, as you'd expect, varied significantly by scenario. For instance, that high electrification scenario projected their peak demand hitting 45,000 megawatts by 2045.
Wow, compared to 28,000 now.
Exactly. Huge growth potential. Whereas their baseline scenario was lower, maybe 36,000 megawatts. That big divergence really underscored the need for a flexible, robust plan.
So, given that wide range of possibilities, what was the actual transmission solution they came up with? Did they just aim for the highest number?
No, they didn't just build for the single highest forecast. Instead, they developed a portfolio of complementary investments phased over time, designed specifically for robustness across those scenarios. They broke it into 3 phases. Phase 1, running roughly 2025 to 2030, focused on what they called foundational projects. Things like the Northern Pass Alternative, a big import line bringing 1,200 megawatts in, plus critical reliability upgrades. That phase cost about $4.2 billion.
Okay, phase 1, foundations.
Then phase 2, maybe 2030 to 2035, involved flexibility projects. This was heavily focused on enabling renewables, particularly offshore wind, building out transmission for 5,000 megawatts of offshore wind, and integrating large-scale energy storage, 2,000 megawatts worth. That was the biggest chunk, about $6.8 billion.
Enabling the transition.
Right. And then phase 3, further out, 2035 to 2045, included more adaptive projects, things like new interregional connections to neighboring grids, and integrating more advanced grid technologies as they mature. That was another $4.0 billion.
So add that all up. That's a staggering $15 billion total investment. How on earth did they justify that kind of spending, especially with all the uncertainty? What was the economic rationale?
That's where the multi-scenario benefit analysis comes in. It really showed the robustness of the portfolio. They calculated the expected benefits, probability weighted across all 4 of their scenarios, and it came out to an impressive $52.1 billion.
$52 billion in benefits versus $15 billion in costs.
Exactly. That yielded a system-wide benefit-cost ratio of about 3.47 to 1. Very strong. But critically, the analysis showed positive benefits, a positive return in all their scenarios, even the pessimistic economic uncertainty one. The benefit-cost ratio was still greater than 2 to 1, even in their worst plausible case.
So it performs well no matter what.
That's the goal of building for robustness. It demonstrated the value across the range of futures they might face.
That's a powerful case. So reflecting on these early implementations like ISO New England's, what's proving to be really effective? What's working surprisingly well in practice?
Well, one of the maybe softer but really important wins is that using this rigorous scenario discipline has genuinely increased stakeholder buy-in. It makes the need and the plan more transparent and defensible. That builds political resilience for these huge long-term plans.
That's huge.
It is. Technically, the modular design approach is proving effective at reducing the risk of stranded assets you don't overbuild too early. Grid-enhancing technologies are providing crucial interim solutions, bridging the gap while the big projects get permitted and built. And better data management tools have allowed for much more rapid scenario updates when conditions change, which is essential for keeping the plan relevant. And that regional coordination, while difficult, has definitely improved the overall project economics by capturing those broader multi-state benefits that Order 1920 emphasizes.
Okay, so those are the positives. What about the flip side? What are some of the persistent challenges that, keep planners up at night with this new 20-year approach?
Oh, there are definitely challenges. Analytical complexity is a huge one. Running thousands of Monte Carlo simulations requires serious computing power and expertise. Just ensuring model consistency across all those runs is tough. Maintaining data quality and consistency over a 20-year period, as we discussed, is a constant battle. And the skill requirements for planning staff have significantly increased. You need people comfortable with probability, statistics, optimization, big data. It's a different skill set.
Human capital challenge.
Big time. Stakeholder management is also incredibly challenging. Trying to explain probabilistic results, there's a 70% chance we need this by 2040, to non-technical stakeholders or regulators can be difficult. Avoiding scenario bias where everyone implicitly favors one scenario over others takes discipline. And just reaching consensus on the key assumptions when there are so many deep uncertainties is hard work. And of course, that regulatory coordination across multiple states for approvals and cost recovery remains a major ongoing hurdle.
Lots to navigate. Based on that, what are the key best practices emerging?
I'd say it boils down to a few things. First, maintain quantitative rigor in scenario development. Use external validation, benchmark assumptions, and update scenarios regularly. Don't let them get stale. Second, infrastructure design absolutely must emphasize flexibility and robustness. Actively seek solutions that work reasonably well across diverse futures, not just optimized for one. And third, the decision-making framework itself should follow a clear, transparent stage gate process, with explicit criteria at each gate focused on things like robustness, flexibility, optionality, stakeholder support, and critically, regulatory feasibility.
So as we wrap up this really insightful deep dive, what does this all fundamentally mean for system planners, for engineers listening right now? What are the key paradigm shifts they need to internalize?
Yeah, I think 20-year planning horizons really represent a fundamental shift in thinking. Planning moves from prediction to preparation. You're no longer trying to perfectly predict the future. You're preparing the system to perform well across multiple possible futures.
Okay, prediction to preparation.
Right. It shifts from optimization to robustness. The primary goal isn't just finding the single most economically optimal solution for one expected case, but developing solutions that are robust, performing adequately, minimizing regret across all scenarios.
Optimization to robustness. Got it.
It moves from static to adaptive. Plans are no longer seen as rigid blueprints set in stone. They are adaptive frameworks designed to be modified and updated as conditions change and uncertainty resolves over time.
Static to adaptive.
From local to regional. Planning focus has to shift beyond individual utility service territories towards coordinated multi-state solutions that capture those broader regional and interregional benefits FERC is pushing for.
Local to regional. Makes sense.
And finally, from deterministic to probabilistic. This is the core analytical shift, moving away from single-point forecasts and embracing probability distributions, Monte Carlo analysis, real options, and risk-based decision-making.
Deterministic to probabilistic. Big changes.
Huge changes, and this really raises an important question for you, our listener, to think about. How is your utility adapting to these new 20-year planning requirements? What scenarios are you finding most challenging to develop, to analyze, and maybe to get consensus on within your own planning processes? Food for thought.
Absolutely. What an illuminating deep dive into engineering for 2045 today. We've really covered a lot, from the depth of traditional forecasting through scenario planning, flexible design, probabilistic methods, right up to that ISO New England case study.
And it's important to remember, this is just one really critical piece of the puzzle that FERC Order 1920 is assembling. Tomorrow, we're going to expand on this even further. We'll dive specifically into those grid-enhancing technologies, the JETs, that the order requires utilities to consider. These technologies are really the tools that provide the near-term flexibility and optimization needed to maximize our existing infrastructure while these huge, long lead-time 20-year projects are being developed and built.
That's going to be a really crucial look at your new planning toolkit, the technologies that help bridge the gap. Definitely make sure you join us for that deep dive tomorrow. And as always, if you'd like to leave feedback or have any questions about today's discussion, please feel free to reach out to us. You can email me at alex.reed.power.podcast@gmail.com.
And you can reach me at emma.quinn.power.podcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you.